If you head to the far, far north of Russia, beyond the Arctic Circle, you'll find a remote group of islands called the Franz Josef Land Archipelago. Almost no one lives here, but the islands hold a surprising amount of fascinating exploration stories. In this video, I wanted to focus on one island in particular, Rudolf Island, or Ostrov Rudolfa, the northernmost island in the entire group. Sitting at nearly 82 degrees north, it's one of the northernmost pieces of land on Earth. Only the northern section of Greenland and the northern part of Ellesmere Island are farther north than Rudolf. It's so far up that the sun doesn't rise at all for over 4 months in the winter, and vice versa in the summer. Up here, what's weird isn't the midnight sun, it's the rare day when the sun actually rises and sets. Let's explore what's actually on this icy, cold, desolate island, and the wild, true stories of people who tried to reach the top of the world from this island. Surprisingly, there's a base in the western side of the island that you can't really see on Google Maps due to poor resolution, but I'll get to that in a second. Almost all of the rest of the island, besides right next to the shores in certain spots, is covered by a thick glacier. In fact, this island gets up to 461 meters high, or 1,500 feet, with a thick ice dome in the middle. Let's start by looking at the northernmost point on Rudolf Island, Cape Fligely. Google Maps has a couple landmarks up here. If you click on this one right here, you can actually see some pictures of this place. Here's a picture that's likely from the summer, as in the winter, the waters around here are completely frozen over. You can see where there isn't a clear shore, there's usually a sheer cliff, so it's not easy to land on this island if you're not in the right place. And this landmark here translates to the northernmost point of the Russian Federation. On the right side of this cape, you see the Holy Cross of Rudolf Island, and this was built in 2003 and was built to be a symbol of all those who explored this area, which we'll talk about now as there's a bunch of stories of people coming up here. Let's go back a bit. In 1873, the Austro-Hungarian North Pole expedition, led by Weyprecht and Peyer, tried to find a route on the Northeast Passage, which would connect Europe to East Asian countries by going over Russia. On their journey searching for the Northeast Passage, they ended up being the one to discover and explore a lot of these islands in the Franz Josef Land. And they named this area after Austrian Emperor Franz Josef I, hence Franz Josef Land. This was a long and complicated expedition, so I'll only share one story from it. They got into a bit of a fiasco while on Rudolf Island. Antonio Zaninovich was crossing the Middendorf Glacier, which is on the southern side of Rudolf Island, and was on a dog sled when he and the dogs fell into a crevice deep in the glacier. Luckily, Johann Haller was nearby and rescued him and the dogs. Shortly after, on 12th of April 1874, the crew reached the northernmost cape of Rudolf Island, which they named after August von Fligely, an Austrian officer and cartographer. And they named the rest of the island after the Crown Prince of Austria, Archduke Rudolf. The whole expedition is really fascinating. Only one of the 25 crew members died, which for back then was a really good survival rate for Arctic expeditions, and one day I want to make a video describing their whole journey. Let's get back to Rudolf Island. This bay on the west side is called Teplitz Bay, and it proved to be a good launching point for ships and expeditions traveling to the North Pole. This was the age of countless attempts to try to get up there, and lots of people tried from this spot. In 1899, Prince Luigi Amedeo brought a team up to Rudolf Island to camp and attempt a dog sled up to the North Pole. They stayed on Rudolf Island over the winter, and he lost 2 of his fingers due to frostbite. When daylight finally started coming in March, he told Captain Cagney to go to the North Pole without him. Cagney and the crew made it up pretty far, up to 86 degrees and 34 minutes north, which if you're looking on Google Maps is about this high. However, the North Pole itself would prove too far. They're running out of food, people were dying left and right, so they planted a flag way up there and turned back to Rudolf Island. 4 years later, another crew came to this exact spot for their own expedition up to the North Pole. This was called the Ziegler Expedition and was led by Anthony Fiala. On August 31st, 1903, they set up a pretty solid camp right in this cape over here. They had a hut with multiple rooms, a tent for the dogs and ponies, an observatory, and an outhouse. Side note, imagine being this far north and having to go sit out in an outhouse to use the restroom in the winter, with polar bears and freezing winds. Anyways, they anchored the ship, called the America, right here in Teplitz Bay. The anchor snapped off at one point and the boat floated away, but it was brought back fairly easily by some crew on the boat. As winter approached in 1903, ice started crushing the ship and they'd lost a lot of their supplies. In March of 1904, they made some efforts to sled up to the North Pole, but failed pretty miserably and turned back within a couple days. In May of 1904, many of the crew members left to go south to Cape Flora here on Northbrook Island, and some of the crew members stayed behind to make more attempts up to the North Pole. These attempts also failed, and in 1905, the remaining crew up on Rudolf Island was finally rescued by the Tierra Nova. In February of 1914, Georgy Sedov on another polar expedition near Rudolf Island was buried up here. For the next section of this video, I'm going to switch to Apple Maps so we can more clearly see the base. Fast forward to the summer of 1932, the USSR started a meteorological station up here, with 4 men stationed there. If you zoom in here on Apple Maps, you can actually see the remains of this base. The conditions turned out to be so terrible up here that it was temporarily abandoned only a year in. Winds on Rudolf Island can commonly reach up to 40 meters per second, and in the winter, there's 4 straight months where it's on average around negative 20 degrees Celsius. A few years later, the station got more action. In 1936, the Soviets built an airfield on Rudolf Island to do an air expedition up to the North Pole. There's not a lot of room on this cape to build a big airfield, and they actually ended up building the airfield near the top of the ice dome. The Soviet Union flew 4 large planes to that airfield and then flew all the way up to the North Pole. Up there, they built North Pole 1, the world's first manned drifting ice station. This was supervised by Professor Otto Schmidt, who I mentioned in my Victoria Island video. This station sat empty from 1942 to 1947. Surely nothing at that time happened to cause that. That's a joke. Then the station was reopened from 1947 and used all the way up to 1995, said to be used for measuring climate data, although there might have been other uses for the space. That leaves us to today. Russia and other Arctic countries have a lot of these Arctic bases way up here that have been rotting away and not in use. In 2010, Russia decided to clear some of these bases, and the base on Rudolf Island was one of those planned to be cleared out manually. There are also occasional touristy trips up here, some of which you can find on YouTube, which I'll link down in the description. Anyways, thanks for watching. Hope you learned something about Rudolf Island, and let me know what island I should cover next.